He preyed on her innocence, took her life, and sent a letter to her parents about how he viciously killed and ate her. Here are 10 serial killers who confessed to their atrocious crimes on camera. Number 10. Ted Bundy.
Developed in me to the point where I began to act out on certain very violent and very destructive feelings.
May 6th, 1975. Ted Bundy picked up a 12-year-old girl named Lynette Dawn Culver. He offered her a ride home but ended up taking her to his hotel. After sexually abusing her, he drowned her in the bathtub of his hotel and went on to dispose of her body in a river. This is just one example of the many minors Ted Bundy molested and killed. Born in Burlington, Vermont, November 24th, 1976, Ted Bundy was a rapist and serial killer. At first glance, Ted Bundy looked like every girl's dream man. He had charming looks and held a degree in psychology from the University of Washington. But he also had a dark and twisted mind that led him down a path to destruction. 1974 was the year it all began, with Ted abducting, sexually exploiting, and murdering 2 young women in Washington. And when his crimes went undetected, Ted Bundy went to abduct and rape dozens of more women, including minors. He found his victims by driving through different states in America. He would offer any woman he found sexually appealing a ride. And then when they got in, he'd knock them unconscious, sexually abuse them, and strangle them to death. The bodies would be then dumped back on the road, and he'd drive off. He's also allegedly responsible for the killing of 8-year-old Anne-Marie Burr, 14-year-old Catherine Devine, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, and so many others. What baffled most people about Ted Bundy was how detailed he was when discussing how he murdered his victims for what he had done. But all that didn't matter, because on January 24th, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed with the electric chair in the Florida State Prison.
I deserve certainly the most extreme punishment.
Number 9. Jeffrey Dahmer.
He was on the couch, lying down with drilling technique had already been applied, and
The name Jeffrey Dahmer is pretty popular on TikTok and other social networks for 2 reasons. 1 is a Netflix documentary on him, and 2 was for his cannibalistic escapades back in the 90s. But did you know that Dahmer was also a child serial killer? Dahmer was born on May 21st, 1960, to parents Lionel and Joyce Dahmer in Wisconsin. As a child, Dahmer was a pretty normal kid, at least so everyone thought. But there was something odd about him. For 1, he was a little too awkward around people, and 2, he had an odd fascination for dead things and animals. Then in his teenage years, when he began consuming excessive alcohol, he also found out he was gay, and he kept it to himself. Then after failing at almost everything he did, his killing spree began. He killed more than 16 men, 2 of which were 14-year-olds. He lured them into his apartment, preyed on them, killed them, and dismembered their bodies. And as if that wasn't brutal enough, he went ahead and cooked body parts because it made him feel closer to the victims. Dahmer wasn't caught until 1991, when one of his victims, Tracy Edwards, was able to escape and report him to the police. And on the inspection of his apartment, they found human parts in his fridge. Drums of acid mixed with human body parts, along with the horrible stench that the investigators say smelt like death.
I'll probably have to live with it for the rest of my life. I wish it would go away. I wish there was some way to completely get rid of the compulsive thoughts, the feelings.
But unlike some serial killers, Dahmer was reserved and wished he could pay back for his own crimes. And after standing trial, he was sentenced to 15 different life sentences. Sadly for him, during his time in prison, he was murdered by another inmate. And according to the story, Dahmer didn't fight back because he actually wanted to die. Number 8. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. The couple Ian and Myra met in 1961, and it just so happened that Myra was deeply in love with Ian. Her obsession led her to do anything Ian wanted, and one of the things he wanted was for her to commit the perfect murder with him. Sounds crazy, I know, but then, in this case, love made them do silly things. On July 12th, 1963, they set out to find a victim. Myra drove in a van while Ian followed on a motorcycle. They abducted 16-year-old Pauline Reed while she was on her way to a dance. They took her back to their apartment, sexually assaulted her, and slit her throat. Their next series of victims were John Kilbride, Keith Bennett, Leslie Ann Downey, and Edward Evans. But after the murder of Evans, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley were caught, arrested, and charged to court, where the judge gave them multiple life sentences. However, Brady died of restrictive pulmonary disease on May 15, 2017, while Myra had passed away from years before from bronchial pneumonia on November 15, 2002. But shortly before that, she said this in an interview.
After the Leslie Ann Downey murder, I didn't think in terms of redemption.
Number 7. John Wayne Gacy. If there's anyone out there who has a fear of clowns, then John Wayne Gacy could be possibly one of the reasons for that. Born in Chicago, Illinois on March 17, 1942, John Gacy was just a normal businessman, but he had a dark side to him. In 1967, he sexually assaulted an underage boy and was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, but only ended up serving 18 months before being released on parole. And that didn't stop John Gacy. As a matter of fact, it made him take things to a whole new level. He began inviting in young boys on a pretense that he had construction work for them inside his apartment. And once they got in, he would sexually molest them, tortured them with a method of his that I'll talk about in a bit, and strangled them to death. Some of the bodies were buried in his basement, while others were thrown into a river. Despite the many cases of young boys going missing, no one suspected John for many years, because he was a reputable businessman and also took up jobs as a clown for kids' parties. However, in 1978, his crimes caught up with him after he was arrested for the murder of Robert Piest, a 15-year-old boy who lived in his neighborhood. During the investigation, the forensics team identified the body parts belonging to more than 10 different boys buried in his basement. But for some reason, John kept denying these allegations against him. In many interviews, he kept disputing the fact that he had never known these boys.
If they want to be convinced or brainwashed into what they believe, then fine, then go ahead and kill me. But vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, because you will have executed somebody that didn't commit the crime.
He also tried disputing the fact that he knotted a rope around the necks of his victims, inserted a stick in the knot, and twisted it around until they were dead. But no matter how much he tried to deny his involvement in over 30 different murders, John Wayne Gacy was found guilty and sentenced to death in 1980. He was placed on death row for 14 years before being executed with lethal injection on May 10, 1994. During those 14 years on death row, John Wayne Gacy still kept denying ever knowing those victims. So could his story be a case of chronic mental disorder? Or was he just oblivious to his own crimes?
Look over at the photos. I have no recollection of any of them. Never met him.
Number 6. Albert Fish. This one right here will send chills down your spine. Albert Fish was born on May 19, 1870, in Washington, D.C. His family is said to have had a long history of mental illnesses. His father passed away while he was still a toddler, and his mother placed him in an orphanage when he was still very young. But while in that orphanage, Albert Fish was tortured and sexually molested. By age 12, he began enjoying this torture, and about 2 years later, he left the orphanage and reunited with his mother. By 20, Albert had become a sex worker, but at the same time he grew a fetish for sexually abusing minors from 5 years of age and below. As crazy as that sounds, Albert also abused himself. He would insert needles and nails of a specific length into his abdomen and groin. But one of his worst crimes came in 1928, when he murdered, cooked, and ate an 8-year-old girl who went by the name Grace Budd. Albert was close to her family and pretended to invite the little girl to a birthday of his niece. But in that dark reality, there was no niece, and Albert did an evil deed. After, he wrote a sadistic letter to the girl's mother, describing in detail what he had done to this poor girl.
I took her to an empty house in Westchester I'd already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped all my clothes off. I knew if I didn't, I would get her blood on them. When she was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry, and I tried to run down the stairs. I grabbed her, and she said she would tell her mama. First, I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite, and scratch. I choked her to death, and then cut her into small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook it and eat it. How sweet and tender her little was, roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body.
The letter was traced back to Albert, and just like other serial killers, he wasn't sorry for what he had done. He said God instructed him to torture those children and that nobody's a saint. Finally, he was sentenced to death and executed on January 16, 1936 via electric chair. Number 5. Luis Alfredo Garavito.
I ask the Colombian people to forgive me, to give me the opportunity which maybe I deprived many people of.
Luis Alfredo Garavito is a Colombian serial killer born on January 25, 1957. As a child, Alfredo was abused by his father while he witnessed his mother's infidelity. So when he became older, he grew a fetish for poor little boys who needed help on the streets of Colombia, or orphans. And Alfredo would take these little boys on the pretense of offering them money, food, and clothing. But in reality, he would take them to the woods, sexually abuse, torture, and then murder them. But it wasn't just the fact that these things mattered, it's how he did them that makes it worse. Alfredo was an alcoholic, and a bottle of liquor was always found at the graveside of his victims. He would sometimes slit their throats, decapitate them, or cut off their genitals and feed them to the victim while they were still alive. As grotesque as that is, it's not even the worst of it. In April 1999, Alfredo kidnapped a 12-year-old boy named John Ivan Sabogal, whom he took to the woods, tied up, and began masturbating over. In the process, another boy spotted him and began throwing stops at Alfredo to get the disgusting act over with. But an angry Alfredo chased this boy into a farm, where he got lost. Sabogal was later found by the police, and after he described what the man looked like, Luis Alfredo Garavito was arrested. However, his arrest was just the beginning of another story. Alfredo denied the charges against him, but after 18 hours of interrogation, Alfredo broke down into tears, begging for mercy on his crimes. He confessed to killing 80 young boys, and upon further investigation, it was uncovered that Alfredo actually molested and murdered 140 young boys, with over 36 buried in the same location. And after standing trial for these murders, Alfredo was sentenced to 1,853 years in prison, the longest sentence ever given in Colombia's history. But due to a law that limits a sentence to only 40 years, Alfredo's sentence was reduced to only 22 years. A man that killed over 140 minors only serving 22 years in prison, and the number of these years could be less if he exhibits good behavior. In 2021, a Colombian judge turned down his release plea, and there's no saying when he'll be getting out.
Very likely that Garavito would be released. Not only likely, it's inevitable. There is no such thing as life without parole.
There is no death penalty.
Number 4. Dennis Nilsen.
And the guard hauled the body out onto the floorboards, put it on the sheet, and then cut it off.
Dennis Nilsen, often referred to on social media as British Dahmer, was born in Scotland on December 23, 1945. And just like Jeffrey Dahmer, Dennis was a serial killer and a cannibal, just based in London. The tales of Dennis's atrocities began in 1974, when he lured a 14-year-old boy to his apartment for a couple of drinks. The young boy and Dennis both slept after having those drinks. But when Dennis woke up in the morning, he didn't want the boy to leave, so he made him stay, and by that, I mean, he killed him. From there, Dennis went on to kill many more teenage boys by luring them into his apartment. And after killing them, he would perform some depraved acts of masturbation on their corpses, sleep next to them, or even lay next to them while he watched TV. Dennis revealed that the reason for this psychotic behavior of his was to satisfy his loneliness and sexual urges. It was revealed that after he had murdered these boys, he'd keep their bodies beneath the wooden floor of his apartment. And if he ever missed them, he'd carry up the semi-rotten corpse and lay next to it. We find Dennis's case describing a man with extreme loneliness, but it doesn't justify the sadistic things done to those innocent kids. And it wasn't until 1981 that his evil deeds began catching up with him. October 1981, he left his old apartment behind. But first, he exhumed all the bodies beneath his wooden floor and burned them in the woods behind his apartment. To conceal the smell of burning flesh, he threw a tire into the fire, and that might have been effective in some sense. But at the same time, the things he did in his new apartment weren't so smart. At his new apartment, Dennis continued murdering young boys, but this time there was no place to hide their bodies. So he dismembered them and stocked their body parts in plastic bags. At the same time, during the process of dismembering these bodies, a few chunks of flesh and bones got wasted, and Dennis tried flushing and sticking them down the drain. Doing this almost repeatedly blocked the drainage system of the entire apartment complex. Neighbors began complaining, and when plumbers were called to come check out this issue, human body parts were found. Then the police got involved, and it wasn't long before the evidence was traced down to Dennis's apartment. He was arrested, charged to court, and given a life sentence. But after battling health problems while in prison, Dennis ended up dying in 2018 at the age of 72.
All gone. Everything's gone. There is nothing left. But I still feel spiritual communion with you.
Number 3. Anthony Kirkland.
And I am responsible for the death of those 4 young ladies. I do not even know why I did it.
Anthony Kirkland is referred to as an American monster, and you'll find out why in a minute. He was born in Fort Campbell, Kentucky on September 13, 1968. Shortly after he was born, he moved with his parents to Cincinnati, Ohio, where he spent the most part of his life. But in this very same town, Anthony Kirkland will end up killing and molesting at least 4 underage girls. And even before that, Anthony will kill his girlfriend, Leola Douglas, back when he was just 21 years old. She refused to have sex with him, so he raped, killed, and set her body on fire to conceal evidence of the crime. Kirkland pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and was sentenced to 10 to 25 years in prison. But after 18 years, he was released, and that's when the real trouble began. Kirkland was called a monster because of his lack of self-control. Between 1998 and 2003, he was placed in solitary confinement 21 times for disciplinary control. And in the last 9 months of his time in prison, he was sent to solitary 4 times for breaking the rules or fighting other inmates. We all know what solitary confinement does to people, and for a man like Kirkland, it made him lose his mind. He went on a sexual abuse spree, killing 4 ladies between May 4th, 2006 and March 7th, 2009. And amongst the 4 ladies, 2 of them were minors. He would rape, kill, and burn the bodies of his victims to hide the evidence. But after killing his 4th victim, Esme Kenny, Kirkland was arrested near the scene because he was in possession of her watch and an iPod. But on August 28, 2018, a Hamilton County judge agreed with the jury's recommendation and sentenced Kirkland to death. As of right now, he's on death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution. Number 2. Robert Black.
I'd be driving along, I'd see a young girl. I'd get out and talk to her and try to persuade her to get into the van. And take her somewhere quiet.
1963. A man named Robert Black kidnapped a Scottish 7-year-old girl whom he took to his house and sexually abused. By the time the girl was unconscious, he had held her by the neck and masturbated all over her body. He was charged with lewd behavior and didn't even get any jail time for this. He was only subjected to a few therapy sessions before they let him go. And letting a man like Robert Black go was probably the worst mistake ever made. Robert Black was in Scotland on April 21, 1947, and was involved in the molestation and murder of 4 girls between the ages of 5 and 16. After his first run-in with the police in 1963, 2 of his neighbors complained about him inappropriately touching their children. He was sent to a rehabilitation center for 6 months, but that didn't help as well. Robert then began watching illicit content of children, and his disgusting obsession with underage girls grew stronger. And on August 12, 1981, he kidnapped a little girl, molested, killed, and dumped her body where no one would find it. Robert Black continued molesting and killing these minors until one day he tried adopting a little girl known as Teresa Thornhill. While Robert was driving around the neighborhood in his vehicle, he spotted Teresa and invited her into his murder van. But while she was getting in, a neighbor, David Herkes, saw her get in and suspected that she was being kidnapped. He then calls the police and describes what the van looks like, launching a search for the vehicle. But then out of nowhere, David Herkes spotted the van once again around the neighborhood, making him direct the cops to where it was parked. When the police forced Robert to open the van, they found Teresa tied up and gagged in a sleeping bag. He had already molested her with his fingers, and he was looking for a good location to end her life and drop off the body before he was found.
Happy that I've survived the tale, but then I look back and think about the poor girls that haven't survived, and sometimes feel so guilty.
Robert Black was charged to court and sentenced to life imprisonment, but he died of a heart attack in 2016, and David Herkes, the man who spotted Teresa in the van, will forever be known as the best neighbor. And number 1, Javed Iqbal. Born in Lahore, Pakistan on October 8, 1956, Javed was a child serial killer in his home country. Javed's father was a businessman, and he wasn't doing bad for himself either, but along the line, a dark side of him developed, making him murder at least 100 Pakistani boys in Lahore. And the twist to his story is that he ended up reporting himself to the police and to a journalist. He wrote a detailed report to this media journalist talking about how he met these boys and how he also murdered them. Of course, now we can't go into the disturbing details here, but in summary, he targeted young boys between the ages of 6 and 16 who were orphans or just hungry children lurking in the streets. Then he would take care of them before dismembering their bodies and killing them. He said he committed these acts as a form of retaliation for what the police did to him and his family. He claimed to have been arrested on charges of sodomy, and on hearing the news, his mom had a heart attack. So as a form of retaliation, he said he would make over 100 mothers feel pain the same way his mother felt it. In November 1999, Pakistan launched a nationwide manhunt for Iqbal, and a month later, he turned himself in to the authorities. He was sentenced to death by hanging. The judge added that his body should be cut into 100 parts and dissolved in acid, the same thing he did to those poor boys. However, Iqbal ended up committing suicide in his prison cell before his execution.
Don't let toxins build up in your body. Try this new Smart Patch instead. It draws out built-up chemicals in the most bizarre way possible. When we saw it on Facebook, we thought it was bullshit. But when we dug deeper, the science actually made sense.
These scientists realized that soles of the feet had the highest concentration of sweat pores in the human body. After hundreds of tests, they perfected an ingenious formula that helps drain the excess fluid through the bottom of the feet without you even knowing it. They named it Nubu, a natural Japanese-inspired foot patches that get rid of unwanted substances, such as bacteria and toxins. They cost less than $2, and the best part, it works while you sleep. These foot pads contain natural ingredients which stimulate acupuncture points in your feet and significantly reduce swelling. Just remove the adhesive backing and apply them to the soles of your feet before bed and wake up to see years of gross toxic waste collected in the patches. Look at Sarah. Every day after work, she had to lay with her legs raised as her legs twitched. She struggled with pain and swollen feet from edema for 2 years, but when she started using Nubu foot patches, she finally noticed how her shoes fit again and her legs were back to normal in less than 10 days. Since their official launch to the public last year, Nubu has sold over 1 million foot patches with happy customers all over the world. The creators of Nubu are offering an exclusive 70% discount just for this video viewers, so you can order a pack of 10 patches for just €8. Nubu is not available on Amazon or in stores. It's available exclusively through this online offer for a limited time. The founders are so confident in the quality of their product that they are offering a 30-day money-back guarantee. Skip those expensive products and bizarre rituals to reduce swelling in your feet and try Nubu instead. Click the link below to visit the official website and order Nubu with a 70% discount while supplies last.